Hey everybody, I am just back from a 2-week vacation that took me to many different parts of the eastern United States. And when I was planning the itinerary of the trip, it occurred to me, based on where we were going to be going, that it would be a great opportunity to capture some impulse responses. In short, impulse responses are a way of measuring a complex system. So you put a burst of energy into that system, and you measure the output, you capture it. In the world of audio production and sound, what that typically means is that we are putting some kind of burst of noise into a space and then recording how the space responds to that impulse or that noise. There are a lot of different ways and mechanisms for capturing an impulse response. One of the most common ways is called a sine sweep, which sounds a little bit like this. What's great about a sine sweep is the level of fidelity you get in the frequency spectrum in terms of how the room responds to individual ranges of frequencies. The alternative to this, which is a burst of white noise, which is a much simpler mechanism, can be subject to some problems. There can be weird phase relationships between frequencies, which may cause emphasis or cancellation of those frequencies in the spectrum just based on the space. There's also things like masking that can create a loss of detail in the impulse response that you capture. But in terms of accessibility and ease of use, we're talking about things like claps or clapper boards, or my personal favorite, which is popping a balloon. Super accessible, super portable, and the results, as we will hear, are quite good. To further illustrate the difference in fidelity you get with a sine sweep impulse versus a burst of white noise like a clap or a balloon pop, I want to draw an imperfect analogy. Imagine an outdoor scene in daylight, and imagine we're trying to capture that scene with a single camera exposure. What we would do is try to find the level of light that allows for the most overall detail to be shown like this. But a consequence of using the best average exposure amount is that we're going to potentially overexpose the highlights in the sky and lose details in clouds and things like that, or potentially underexpose things in the dark parts of the image like the shadows and lose detail there. Conversely, a sine sweep is like taking a bunch of exposures from underdeveloped to overdeveloped and then blending those frames together so that we get the most detail and resolution possible. What I would like to do today is to take the impulse responses you've been watching me create, prepare them for use in a convolution reverb, and then compare them side by side with some of the ones that I took on my trip, just so you can get a sense of the aesthetic these can create on a few different sound sources. Let's jump into the DAW and we'll cut up some impulse response recordings. Okay, we've got our sine sweeps queued up in here. Here's left channel sine sweep. And right channel sine sweep. Gonna bounce those out in sequence because that is what IR tool, which is Altaverb. Altaverb is a convolution reverb plugin. That's the format that it prefers. If you have your own sine sweep convolver, it may be different, so you'll want to check the manual for that. But I'm using IR tool today. That's super important. We're going to process this quickly. All right, and now we've got our convolved sine sweep IR. Let's move on to our claps and our balloon pop. I just want to point out one thing here. So here's a series of claps, and I tried to make each one sound different on purpose. This is one of the potential pitfalls for using claps as your generator for an impulse response. It's just really hard to get a consistent sound out of a clap, even if it's the same person moving exactly the same way with, the approximate same amount of force. So it's a quick and dirty way of doing it. So if that's all you got, it's totally fine. But you can hear Each one of those is just slightly different in tonality, slightly different in volume. So let's just pick our favorite. Actually, I like that first one. We'll just stick with that. So what I'm going to do now is trim that out individually, wider, so you can see. And I'm going to attempt to find the point at which the clap begins based on the waveform. So it looks like the first transient kind of starts here. So I'm just going to clip it here. Normally, if you're editing audio in this manner, you'd want to include some kind of fade in of some degree just to make sure there wasn't any clicks and pops when played back. But in this instance, with impulse responses, I've found it's just not super important. In fact, you kind of want just the transient in front anyway. Otherwise, if you try to build in a fade in or any kind of ramp into the impulse, it creates some weird effects in the eventual convolution, which sounds like it's a slight delay or something. So I've just tend to avoid adding fade-ins on the front end. But I will add a fade-in on the out just to make it sound a little more natural. Forward a little bit. I think I moved my foot or something. All right, good enough. So we're going to bounce that as our clap, living room clap. Okay, now let's move on to the balloon pop. We're going to have to turn down the gain on this guy because it is very loud. Since I was recording a bunch of different impulses at different volumes in sequence after another, I opted to record in 32-bit format, which allows you to adjust gain after the fact and avoid clipping unless you clip the microphones, which I don't think I did. But super useful when you're dealing with balloons because they can be very, very loud, as was the case here. But so I'm just going to do essentially the same thing I did with the clap IR preparation. I'm just going to find the start of the transient, which is right here. And going to clip it there. We'll listen back to natural point where it feels like the reverb is done, and then slight fade out. All right, and there is our balloon pop. Right, through the magic of cinema, the magic of editing, I've got a new session open, and I've got each of our impulse responses from the sine sweep, the balloon pop, and the clap in sequence, so we can both hear how they sound different and see with Pro Q4's spectrum analyzer how they actually energy-wise differ. Now, you're going to hear this without any visual aid. And remember, this is all taken from the same room in roughly the same location in that room with the mics stationary. So you begin to understand how impulse responses can, depending on how you generate them, can have a huge impact on the output and what they eventually sound like. So here's the sound sweep. Here is the balloon pop. And here is the hand clap. Once again, sine sweep, very balanced. Balloon pop, kind of mid-heavy, maybe a little bit of heavy in the highs too, and clap, mostly in the high end. Now that we've listened to the impulse responses alone, we're going to listen to them on some program material. So I've got a short drum loop by a local drummer by the name of Nabeti Osorio. Shout out to her. And I've got 3 buses set up. Each one has an instance of Sound Designer, which is Logic's native convolution reverb. And we're first going to hear the dry drum loop to just get a sense of what that sounds like. And then each of the buses right now is set to fully wet reverb sound. So we're going to hear how distinct each one of those impulse responses is in practice without any of the dry signal. All right, so here's Nabedi, just dry drum kit. Here is Convolution Reverb 1, which is the Sine Sweep. Here's Convolution 2, which is the balloon pop. And Convolution 3, which is the clap. So you see there, quite a distinction. It's the same space, same basic principle in play, but just the fidelity of the Sine Sweep comes through in how much bass information there is. There's not a whole lot of bass information in the balloon pop. There is basically none in the clap, which is not to say the balloon or the clap are not usable or good. It's just a very particular sound. So maybe a little bit more specific in terms of how you might use it. So now I'm just going to do that one more time, but I'm going to mix dry and wet signals to taste, and we'll ABC them while I'm doing that once I've got my settings in place. Here's an ABC comparison of the three. Sine Sweep. Balloon pop. Clap. Sine Sweep. As you can see, there's a lot of flavor going on, and which flavor is the best, you can be the judge. For my tastes, I do like the Sine Sweep just because it feels very natural. On the drum kit, my choice might change depending on if the program material were different, but also I noticed in auditioning them side by side, there's some less than ideal resonances in the balloon and clap, which kind of are causing a ringing with the snare drum, which I probably would need to EQ out. So again, it's just the smoothness of the Sine Sweep response tends to produce the easiest results to work with. But that's not to say the others are invalid or unusable by any means. So far, we've been trying to faithfully recreate the sound of a room, but what if we were to be unfaithful? So what I've done is I've post-processed my favorite of the impulse responses, the Sine Sweep, in 3 different ways. The first was just adding a Haas effect, so slightly delaying one of the channels, just to try to get a larger sense of space in the room and to drop out of the middle a little bit. So I've got my friend Damian Sanchez on tenor saxophone here queued up. So I'll bring this in slowly, but you'll hear it can be used as an effect rather than a reverb. It's a little bit of a slapback echo. Let's get a little more experimental. Here's the same sine sweep processed with distortion and a little bit of echo. Kind of weird, very bassy, rumbly. All right, for this last experiment, I've taken that same impulse response, bit crushed it, and then used a reverb plugin to kind of create this reverse reverb wash that follows the impulse. So this one should sound pretty different. That's all for this video, but as a special bonus, I'm releasing all of the impulse responses that I recorded while on my trip, which you can find in the video description below. Not only that, but I'm including a pack of responses from the New World Center, which is the place that I work on Miami Beach, Florida. And if you're unaware, it's a Frank Gehry designed performance venue with just some incredible spaces that have amazing acoustics. So if you make something really awesome with any of this material, please put it in the comments below. I'd love to listen to it. And I'm also going to link you to Convology XT, which is a free convolution reverb plugin in the event that you don't have something already to use in your DAW. That's it for this time. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.